Good morning. So as usual, I think the way I carry out my lectures, I welcome the participants to, share your opinion anytime you want. I think it's much more interesting to have a discussion rather than me just lecturing. So feel free to turn on the video and, chat with me while I'm giving this talk. So this is just a lecture series for those who never been here before. The being, knowing, and doing was really from one of the very great movie called The Grandmasters. And the reason I chose this topic is because I'm one of those people who have like a foot in two worlds. As an immigrant, came here as an immigrant, and as an immigrant, you usually try to learn things by looking at it from two different angles. And I think this is true for many bilingual people who are bilingual. Interestingly, research show that they have the ability to look at the world in two different ways. So kind of free us up to look at things a little bit differently. So the way I learned about Buddhism, same thing. I would learn the Buddhism in the traditional way, but I will also look at Buddhism from a psychological perspective. So that's what inspired this talk. And being, knowing, doing is one of the famous quotes from this great movie. So if you've never seen it, do watch it. And in the movie, it says, to be the great master, there are three stages: seeing oneself, seeing the world, and seeing all living beings. So they translate it as being, known, and doing. And one of my most favorite Zen poem was really from Dogen, which talk about how if you want to study way, you need to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be enlightened by all things of the universe. So basically, I think this goes very well with what I just said earlier, how I have a foot in two worlds, because as a trained mental health professional, I'm always interested in what are the similarity and differences between the Zen approach, the Buddhist approach versus the Western psychotherapeutic approach. And I think our master, Sifu, Master Shen Yan, mentioned very well that the practice of Chan, the practice of Buddhism, are basically a process of affirming oneself, transforming oneself, and dissolving oneself. So in other words, it's quite important to have a healthy self before we can target no self, if anything. And I think and there's an old saying in the Chinese that before you become the Buddha, you be a good person first. And so that's also going along the line of what we're focusing on. So I'm just reviewing for those who never been here before. The idea is that if we want to understand no self, we should have a good idea what the self is and what is the self that we are talking about. So one important question, I guess, from the East or the West is really, what is the self and who am I, right? This is quite important question, not just for Buddhists, but I think in general, even in the clinical settings, people who are not healthy psychologically tend to struggle even more with this kind of question. So it's important, I think, for all Buddhists in general, or people who are interested in Buddhism, to have some awareness that, having a healthy self is quite important, because without it, we may use Buddhism or any spiritual practice as just another tool to build up a bigger self. Okay, a tools to run away from our problem. So Dharma, I think Dharma, of course, is medicine, and the Buddha is a great doctor. But just like regular medicine, if you use it right, it's medicine. If you don't use it right, it can be poisonous. So here, and this again, this is just a review what I talked about before. Here are just some of the common issues that people may use Buddhism as a defense, or just another way of saying that, as a way to escape from problems. So, you know, and this is what we talked about before. So for example, someone may use practice as a way to avoid responsibility. I remember one time we were at a retreat, it's time to do working meditation, and some people are still sitting there and not doing a thing because they're practicing. So it's funny. I mean, of course, I assume they are getting into their practice very well. But I remember one time, I guess the retreat leader, the retreat teacher said, don't do silent when you see the work coming. And, it's speaking along the line of sometimes we use Dharma as a way to run away from problem. And here are just some other possibility, how we use practice to substitute for grief, to avoid anger, or to be a bit more self-assertive, or rationalize our fears, to be intimate with people. So it's quite important to know ourselves so we can use the Dhamma correctly. And I think now I'm going to talk a little bit about, before we move on to having a healthy self, just want to focus on, again, on what does it mean to have what is the concept of no self. And I'm based my talk on Jack Angler's. One of the famous Jack Angler's quote is, "Before you can be nobody, you need to be somebody." And so, just to be clear, that the no self that's like the Buddhism is talking about is not so much of the psychological self that we are talking about today. I think all Buddhist teachers recognize that it is important to have a healthy ego, and there are basic normal psychological functioning that a normal person should carry out. And I'm pretty sure all good Buddhist teachers have a very strong sense of what is it to be psychologically healthy. The no self in the Buddhist tradition is not so much focusing on the psychological self, but really the ontological self. The concept that somewhere deep within us, we believe there is an inherent ontological core at the center of our experience that is separate, substantial, enduring, and self-identical. So this is sort of almost our cognitive distortion, where we need to see things, we need to solidify and verify our experience, not just the self, but any phenomenon into a thing, as if that thing is always there. It's as if that thing can exist independently. So for example, if I ask you, and here's a famous example from the Middle Path Treaty. If I say, can you show me the fire? You're like, sure, you could show me the fire. But if I say, can you show me just the fire and nothing else? I just want to see the fire and fire itself. You can't, because you can only generate fire from something else, because the fire is made up of everything that's not fire. So there's no fireness. This fire has no self in that sense. So this is the kind of no self I would say the Zen tradition or Buddhist tradition focus on. Okay. Now, just to talk about no self a bit further, again, I'm just reviewing again for those who weren't here last time. What are the possible experiences of the self that we can carry out? And these are for the normal people like me and you. One common experience about the self is discontinuous and multiple, meaning that we tend to have different self at different situations. Our sense of self changes in different environment, and this is quite normal. It's quite normal. I'm sure, sometimes when I see my students in my classroom, they have this one persona, but when I bump into them in the cafeteria, they could be quite different. And again, our self can be quite discontinuous depending on who are we with. You can also think of an example. Imagine you're watching a movie by yourself in a theater. How does that feel as a person versus if you watch a movie with a friend or with a partner? You don't even need to talk to each other. The sense of self is already different, even when you watch a movie together versus when you watch by yourself. So our self experience is quite multiple in some sense. Another kind of experience of self that we may have is really self is integral and continuous. So even though we may have different sense of self at different situation, but underneath of us, we feel that there is sort of a master version that give a sense of continuity. And this is quite healthy, by the way, although we're talking about no self, but a healthy person need to have this kind of continuity in order to function in a normal society. So when we could, and this is quite important psychologically as sort of as a survival tool, because if you could see yourself as integrated and continuous, there's a sense of self-cohesion, the idea that even when things fall apart, you are still there. There's a sense of freedom and control, and there's a sense of personal worth. If you don't have this function, if you cannot see yourself as integrated and continuous, in fact, one of the most famous problem for people who have this issue are the people who suffer from personality disorder, such as borderline personality disorder, where they cannot see themselves as one, but they can only see themselves as either good or bad. And because you can only see the world in two versions, you can only see other people as good or bad. And what happens is that then your relationship can become very rocky and very rough and discontinuous. So this is another kind of possible sense of self we may experience. The third possibility is where sometimes the literature would describe when people have this kind of peak experience, like the athlete would talk about how they would be playing, let's say, or they'd be driving a car, let's say a car racer, and they feel the car and then becomes one, or the car and the car racer and the environment becomes one. And I think athletes sometimes talk about how they are being in the zone. So this is where, this kind of self would be sort of the self temporarily drops away, where we're not actively become aware of the self that's there. So the idea is that knower, the knowing, and the known are all experienced as one. And often people experience is quite profound. This temporary loss of selfhood could be quite profound. Unfortunately, though, this is often temporary and transient that goes away, while the problem of the self are just suppressed. So in the Chan tradition, this is often labeled as oneness or unification. So if you took our sort of basic meditation class, these are the sort of the 7 stages of meditative practice. And like when we try to harmonize our mind, where the initial stage, our mind is very scattered, and then slowly, once we have a method, so we could follow the method, and eventually 3, 4, and 5 means our mind is very concentrated. Stage 6 is really describing that unification. Again, I would say stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are all just different states of mind that we may experience. Now, then, of course, there's the stage of no self, which I'm really, I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about it, but I can just give you what is being described. And but before I move on, any question from anyone? I think it's probably it's much better if people have questions or any issues. Yeah, Harry.
Unmute.
Hey, and I cannot see you.
Can you hear me? Oh wait, I'll unmute 1 second. I'll appear.
Hey, Harry.
How are you doing?
Yeah, awesome.
Thanks for giving a talk on this trivial manner.
Awesome.
There's so much in here. Well, I had some thoughts earlier, and I just thought you might want to address them.
Sure.
So one of the things I read years ago, I was coursing through the deep internet, and I was reading about 2 truths, and someone said that deep down, everybody thinks that they don't really exist. So I found that as a very interesting thought, had some resonance, right? Because when you do try to find out what exists, it's continually changing, right? That's the issue. Also, with the Dogen quote, about forgetting, study the self is to forget the self.
Yeah.
I realize that when most people, including myself, hear that, we sort of think to study the self is to get rid of the self, and that's not what it says at all, right?
No.
So then you sort of wonder, is the self is just a funny word? This is what you're talking. What is it really? And we have a series of functionality that's available to us. And sometimes you can label that functionality as a self, and sometimes a variety of other things.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And I think that's just a real open way of looking at it, because it's, we're talking about something that doesn't exist as we think it is. So it's like, in a certain sense, you're starting off on the wrong foot as soon as you talk about self. That's the conundrum, right?
Well, I think, just to respond back, I think one thing people are most afraid of is to be nothing.
Yeah, right.
And people love meaning, yet world is quite meaningless in a existential way. It's if you think about it, it's the meaning that we gave to our experience tend to be quite simplified, right?
So, as a psychologist, Peter, what do you think of this pandemic problem we have of poor self-image? Where people who don't really like or value themselves. What do you see? How does that fit in?
Well, I would say, well, I mean, there are many reasons why people have poor self-image. I mean, one quick answer for that is whatever make who you think you are came from everything that's not, right? I mean, from our experience, who we are often come from our experience, from what people told us, and society today is really not very helpful in terms of building the self-image, because the moment you turn on the media, social media, it's always reminding what you don't have and what you should be.
Right.
Right. So this is very classic story, like ugly duckling story, right? Everyone's telling you how you're not something you're not. And then we often have the wrong idea. I think Buddhism and modern psychology have the same concept, is that people have the wrong idea about who they really are.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So don't believe everything you think.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is that, right? So yeah, but I think that's a good.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's a thanks for chipping in. Yeah, awesome. So I mean, now I'm still gonna talk about like what. So what is this no self that which I'm not qualified to talk about, but I'm gonna talk about it anyway. Right. Uh, so this is not, well. First of all, it's not the same as the oneness. That's for sure. The oneness is that the laws of the self in temporarily is very different than what the no self we're talking about here. And this goes beyond of realizing, this goes beyond that there's no separate self. Yeah, Bob, you have a question before I move on? Bob? Okay, I'm just gonna keep going then. And usually the way we were taught in, I guess, different Buddhist school to realize that's the seventh stage, right? The stage of awakening is through the method. And there are two basic methods that were taught. The first route to realize this new way of being is really by focusing on the awareness itself, right? Shifting our subjectivity from the representation of the self to the awareness itself. And so some of the charm method is helping us to sort of, like silent elimination, for example, would be like the method of no method, right? The idea is.
Oh, now you can.
So sorry, Bob?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was having trouble unmuting.
Oh, I cannot
First,
see you
thanks,
either.
thanks, Peter. Sorry to interrupt, but I had a question from a minute or two ago,
Okay.
and I didn't want to lose the thread.
Sure.
Shifu, you had mentioned that when your students see you in the classroom, and then they see you in the cafeteria, the self is different, or they act differently?
No, I see them act differently. Like
You see
when
them
they're
act
not,
different.
when they're with me, they're very timid. When they're with their friends, they act totally having fun.
Yes. Okay. So I wanted to talk about that for a second because Shifu once asked us in a class or something, just posed the question, are you the same person with your family as you are at work and with your friends?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of hit me kind of deep, where I felt like I feel a certain phoniness with people, like I'm acting a certain way. And his question, the essence of it pointed to, are you yourself? Are you genuine with your friends, your family? Of course, I'm going to joke differently with my father when my father was alive, with friends and with certain people, with bosses. There'll be certain things that I do, but I felt like he was pointing to being genuine with everybody and not changing to form to what they're doing. So it made me more aware of how I am with people, and like, oh, I was so like timid with my boss, I was acting differently, whereas with my friends I am confident, for instance.
Sure.
And it pointed to, I thought what he was saying was, you shouldn't be a different person. Yes, you're going to kind of act differently, but I don't even know how to describe it better than what I'm saying, but I feel like the goal to me was to become genuine and to be open and honest and compassionate and not arrogant with people. Not feel like people I feel like I might be smarter than, not be arrogant, people I feel like I'm dumber than, not feel inferior. Just be me, whatever that means exactly, and feel like I'm doing my best, I'm being genuine, and then I am the same person with everybody. I might do different things and stuff, but that's what's made me happy, is feeling like I don't change when I'm with somebody who's a boss. I don't change when I'm somebody who's famous. I mean, I do, because I'm still vexed. But that to me was the goal, is to be consistent and genuine, so that it doesn't feel like afterwards I was so funny. Why was I so afraid of this person? I wouldn't be afraid if it was so. Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, you're really talking about my second type. What Sid was talking about is really the second self, right? Self as integral and continuous, right? Genuine, also, I would say genuine means what? Your value, your ethics, right? The way your self-image are there, but it's quite normal that we need to have different personas sometimes at different situations. And I think that's a spectrum too. It's when I'm hanging out with my basketball buddies, I don't think I act the same way when I'm at work. I mean, that's just quite normal. And you don't want to act the same way when you go to party, dancing, or clubbing while you're at a temple. So we do have, normally we should carry different personas. But at the same time, deep down, we know who we are, right? I mean, so a healthy person should have the function of these two. That makes sense?
Yeah, I just want to be careful. I would, when I hear a different persona, it makes me think in terms of language that we're talking about pretending and acting a certain way as if we're supposed to, and we feel like we're conforming to something, and we're not really that way, but we feel pressure to be that way. Whereas it's not persona like I'm changing deliberately. I'm changing. It's more like, of course, I'm not going to tell dirty jokes in the temple. Well, no, I could.
You could.
Of course, I'm not going to tell
be
dirty
yourself.
jokes. Yeah. Let me think of a better example off the top of my head. Like I'm not going to dance at a funeral because I know that would be disrespectful, or I think it would. But being genuine inside, and when I hear the word persona, I'm careful.
Yeah.
I feel it hits me a certain way. It sounds like I have to act. I have to be someone else. That's what I'm saying. Be someone else when you're with your friends. Be someone different. No, be the same person with everyone, but act accordingly. And you're the same person, genuine. You're inside. That I guess you have to sort of get to know and become. Like that's been a practice for me to try and be like not arrogant when I'm in a situation that I'm feel like, well, I did a good job. I should be arrogant. And then someone did a better job. I feel inferior. Like just like the persona word makes me a little uncomfortable, I guess, because it sounds like contrived, something I'm supposed to do and be fake so that I put on this persona where it's just one thing, but it changes accordingly because I'm not going to, I don't want to be phony with certain people and feel like I'm myself with others.
So what I'm talking about is definitely not about being phony, but of course, I think there is, so this just give you an extreme. These are all in continuum, right? So unhealthy person would be very, like one way, often what we do, people get stuck is they either act like a person what other people want them to be. That's one problem, right? You don't want to be that. You don't want to be the person. You don't want to act like some.
I agree.
And then on the other extreme spectrum of the spectrum is that sometimes we hear people say, I want to be myself. And you know what happened is they become a big baby. They just want to do whatever they want because they want to be themselves. So the trick is how to be yourself at the same time without violating other people's boundary, right?
I think
so you don't want to be totally someone else when you're with other people, but at the same time, you don't want to be a big baby either. You see what I mean? Yeah. So again, a healthy person should be able to have a good sense of self-cohesion, self-worth, right? That's what being oneself means. Yet at the same time, it can adapt to the social environment, right? So you carry different sense of self. And these are just common possible self-experiences that we can experience. Just again, these are just all I'm describing right now are just different states of mind or different states of self that we may experience as a person. Now, regarding no self, again, you can only experience it if you really practice. And here are two ways of practicing that we know of from different school of thought. One school is more focusing on the subjectivity or the awareness itself. Another school is more focusing on sort of the object of our consciousness. So one is more focusing on the subject, one is more focusing on the object. So when you're focusing on the object, you're more focusing on how the transient nature of that mental object. And again, I think this is just quickly review from what I was talking about last time. And this is just a quick chart. I mean, I talked about it last time too. This is from Master Jichen, talk about how there are different methods that we can practice to see the true nature of our mind, which is supposed to be free. Yeah, I'm going to skip this part. So the idea is that if you practice, you get to have a chance to experience the empty nature of our mind. And because I'm partly involved in the research world, and so the researchers are also interested in how those meditative practice could be useful and helpful for us. So for example, some researcher would be interested in how different kind of meditative practice have any kind of benefit neurologically for our mind. And so for example, usually when people's mind are wandering, or when people think about the sense of self, what happened is their default mode of network part of the brain is active. So I guess the picture on the right, I mean, I'm using the sort of Netflix version of this. So picture on the right shows how when we're thinking of the self, the past or future, mind wanders, or even thinking the sense of self, these two areas would light up. However, when people engage in like mindfulness practice, this part would light up and suppress these parts. So it's quite interesting to see neurologically, there's some like evidence that maybe when we are training our mind, it is doing something that's measurable. And this is just another chart that shows how scientists try to communicate the way they study meditation or the way we train our mind. And in general, when we train our mind, when you look at different traditions, there are sort of three dimensions that we can describe or measurable. Again, science is all about measuring. So when we talk about whether or not training the mind works or not, you have to, if you want to say something works, you need to measure it. So this is a little bit different, I guess, from the Buddhist tradition. So usually when we train our mind, there are three dimensions we can train. The first dimension is something called object orientation. Object orientation is focusing on how our mind has the ability to focus on one thing or orient our mind towards one thing. So when we're meditating, when we're focusing our breath, that would be object or orienting our mind towards the breath. Or even if the object's not there, let's say we lost our key, we're looking for the key. That looking is also an orientation towards something. So the kind of meditation practice that train you to have a high object orientation are often called a focus attention practice. In the Buddhist tradition, the focus attention type of meditation is normally sort of focusing on mantra, focusing on breath, focusing on some kind of object, or the shamatha practice, I would say. The training of our mind to be still. That would be the focus attention training. So in this chart, if you look at object orientation, where the meditation that have high object orientation tends to be on focus attention techniques. Now, another dimension that help us to realize what aspect of mind we're really training at is what's called a de-reification dimension. And this dimension is the idea where when we're practicing, thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are interpreted as mental processes rather than an accurate depiction of reality. In other words, if you are high in de-reification dimension, then you are able to realize thoughts are not fact. So or our feelings are not fact. So if you look at this chart, the meditative practice that's really high on de-reification practice are some of the meditative practice called open monitoring. So in general, in the science field, we categorize meditative training into at least two basic types: focus attention and open monitoring. Open monitoring means that you don't really have a specific object you can focus on, but is really just open up your awareness. So very much like silent illumination, where we're just focusing on awareness or experiencing itself. So if you're good with that approach, then you see how de-reification is very high. Object orientation is quite low because you're not focusing on anything particular, right? So this would be sort of like silent illumination. And the third dimension is meta awareness. And what the colloquial way of talking about meta awareness would be more the ability to know that your mind wanders, right? I would say the ability to know that your mind wanders is really that background awareness. You know how we're focusing on our breath, or we're focusing on our mantra. While we're focusing, we know what happened behind the scene. Like if there's wandering thoughts, you know. Because how you know? Because that background awareness. A typical example of this background awareness would be, let's say, in the psychology lab, would be, let's say I show you a picture of a person who's really suffering, yet I ask you a question like, how old is this person? So your task is to tell me how old is this person. So while you could tell me how old this person, at the same time, though, your background awareness pick up how this person is suffering. So that's what I meant. So that would be an example of meta awareness. So again, certain meditative practice, usually meditative practice would make you higher in this level, in this dimension. So for example, the open monitoring technique will make you become high in meta awareness, low in object orientation, and high on de-reification. These are just, again, why would scientists build this kind of model is so that we can communicate with each other and know what exactly we're measuring. So you can continue the research in this process. So other stuff I didn't talk about is like depending on what kind of meditative practice you have, you could have more things you can talk about are such as aperture. The sort of aperture is sort of talking about how the feel of your awareness could be very small, like just at your tip of your nose, or it could be very wide to the whole environment, or clarity, or stability, or how much effort. So again, although we don't know, I mean, most of us don't know what no self mean, but here are some of the methods that can help us to realize this new way of being. And Yeah, I'm gonna skip this part. Yeah. Now, just to talk a little bit about what that no self mean conceptually, because I can only talk about it conceptually. That concept of no self, I guess one example I can think of is Lego. I guess this here is a Lego of Voltron. I don't know any of you play Voltron or watch Voltron before. This is like a robot. So this is like a Lego version of Voltron. So normally, with Lego, when you open the box, you get the Lego piece, you can put them together, and you form, let's say, a Voltron. But if you really kind of start to break down this Voltron is made up by this person is made up by 5 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sort of like the 5 skandha. So is there's this Voltron, does this Voltron have a self when it's made up by 5 little guys? Right, this is one way. It does. We did not say this Voltron do not exist. We just say, is there a real self for this Voltron when this Voltron is made up by 5 things? But if you think about further, so this Voltron has no self. But if you look at further, each dharma, I guess you could call it those 5 skandha, right? Each skandha is also made up by Lego, right? Something else. So does each piece itself has a self in it, right? Have a self in it. But if you look really further, if you have a Lego game, if you have Lego, do you have to does that mean you can only build your Lego in one way? That does like when you buy a Lego for your kid, do they only play it one way? Do they only build it one way, or they can always rearrange the Lego into something else? So I would say the realizing of no self is almost like realizing that we're not the Voltron, but we're the Lego. Right? We're not the Voltron, we're the Lego. If you realize you're not a Voltron, but the Lego, then you can start to have freedom to rearrange yourself to other different ways where that's more beneficial for self and others. So for example, you can rearrange yourself into something else. But again, Lego is just game. And if you realize you're not Lego, but you're really the game itself, then there are many different ways to become a game, right? There are many different type of game. It could be Lego game, like a Monopoly, it could be Go. Game exists everywhere. Right. So the concept of no self is really, I guess, that we often mistaken the self in a very limited way. So to mistaken who we are as who we really are is like mistaking ourselves as Voltron instead of the game. I would say that's just an analogy I can think of. In other words, the no self that Buddhism is talking about is really talking about that. How is pointing out how we have a very limited view on who we really are. So I'm just giving you, of course, there's always critics in the world. I mean, people love to be critical. So you know, when the Buddhists talk about no self, of course, some of the famous psychologists would have some questions. And the question is, are you sure that there's so-called no self, or the so-called no self is just another state of self, right? Because we were talking about how the self can be continuous, could be separate, could be oneness. And are you so sure that no self is our natural states of mind, or is it just another state of self that we create? That is I guess that is the key critics that focus on. And the key point here then is that the problem is that it is when in the Buddhist tradition, the no self, the concept this concept no self is really not a description of reality. It's not a description of reality. It's just pointing out what's not. So for example, in the ancient time, when people see cloud and thunder and lightning, people would assume there's some Thor out there striking the hammer, the Thor god, the god of thunder striking. You could tell those people there's no Thor, but it does not mean there's no lightning and thunder. I mean, that is just totally different matter. So to say that there's no self is the same problem. You can't really prove something that's not there directly. The best thing you can do is by asking you to show what you think the self is, and then we tell you that whatever you think the self is, there's a better explanation for it. So here is an example. You know how when we're a kid, sometimes the kids are afraid because they're afraid to go to sleep, and they say there's bedside monster. And if the parents want to reassure the kid, the parents could keep telling the kid that, yeah, but there's no bedside monster. That's probably not gonna reassure the kid too much. But the kid's gonna be arguing, yes, but there is, right? So when the Buddha tell people there's really no real self, people's gonna be like, what are you talking about? There is. I feel it all the time. Just like the kids say there's a real bedside monster. So the best thing then the parents can do is really, okay, show me where the bedside monster is. And the kids will be showing, you see that shadow, you see that black thing there, and the parents gonna provide an explanation. Okay, yeah, I see that black thing there, but that's called shadow. It's created by light. And you see that red thing there? Yes, that's called the socks, but when the light is dark, that look like something else. So you can only sort of point out what it is not, instead of proving what it is. So this is sort of the one thing, I guess, what Buddha invite all of us to do as well. Whatever you think the self is, look deeper and see what it really is, right? Whenever you think, and this is something therapists do too, like, patient will come in and say, I'm a loser. Okay. Like, so how did you become the loser? What does that mean? Okay, define what loser is. I'm a loser because my boss yelled at me. Okay, but the boss yelled at you because he's in a bad mood, but does that mean you're a loser? You see how you can only really break down something that's not there, something that's not real, by looking deeper into it, right? So but however, because human has the tendency, and the reason why we tend to solidify or verify our experience into a thing is it takes a lot of understanding. It takes a lot of interest to see how we tend to do that. And I would say the middle path is quite good at describing how we're really good at turning something into a thing right away. So when people think there's something and you tell them there's nothing, they will turn nothing into a thing, right? So the Buddha, when we feel must be a self, then when Buddha said there's no self, then somehow no self become a new self. And then you have to teach people, well, okay, then the no self and the self really is, is not there. And then people turn that into, again, another thing. So it's like, I guess one way to think about it is we tend to see the world in a horizontal manner, dualistic manner. And when the Buddha tells us to look at it from a more meta perspective, which is vertical, we quickly take that into a horizontal. So it's always we're always doing this mental game with ourselves. So I think fundamentally the concept of no self is really pointing to our sort of our default cognitive distortion, where we have this need to see things as always there, to see things that's independent, and to see things that has some real substance to it. So not only we seeing ourselves this way, but we see all phenomenon in the same way. So that's where the real target is, to realize our sort of our common mental habit, and don't take that mental habit too seriously. So here is Thich Nhat Hanh, how Thich Nhat Hanh talk about it. Normally we see the world in a divided way, either mind or matter, or subject or object. But in reality, Thich Nhat Hanh used A prime, B prime. So A and B, what we really experience are sort of the tip of iceberg, tip of A and tip of B. Well, and so the dotted line means we're missing a lot. We're not seeing the true nature of all phenomena. We are often just seeing the surface. So to have a realization is to really see things as they are, A and B. And once we realize our cognitive habit, then we can function in the world in a way where we could see the whole picture, yet at the same time, we still can interact with people in terms of what they see, A prime, B prime. So this is sort of another way of talking about how this new way of being, the being of no self. I talk so much about no self today without even knowing what it is. So you guys just have to bear with me. You know, this is all concept. I think my job really, my expertise is really just talking about how to be healthy, to have a healthy personality. So you could think of this as ultimate mental health, right? Ultimate mental health. I like this, and I always like this film because you know how most of us live like, if you ever seen the movie Matrix, most of us live like Neo, and then we are hoping to know what the Matrix looks like, and then we finally get to see the Matrix, and now we can function a lot more than what we can normally function. Yet at the same time, we still can interact in the Matrix, but with a lot more possibility. Anyway, so the self, I would say, is a very useful metaphor that help us to function in the world. And if you're a healthy person, you should have a healthy sense of self, which is because the healthy sense of self is a nice tool to help us to survive. But just to realize this, the self is not real, but it's not unreal. It's not real and unreal, and it's not neither real nor unreal. So this is something we should be mindful of. So Harry, what do you see here?
Well, first of all, you disillusioned me. I always thought I was Voltron. So you're telling me I'm not Voltron. So that's something I have to work through.
Yeah. You're neither Voltron nor not Voltron.
Okay. But
right?
on a more serious, and I know this is what the question I'm going to ask is probably, 20 lectures, but the thing that's the glue that's causing our suffering is fear, right? That's the last thing to go in the Heart Sutra. So if you could talk a little bit about attachment, like why do we come up with this strategy of or this why do we hold on to this illusion of self?
I mean, the quick answer for that, scientifically speaking, they have evolutionary advantage as a human being, right? I mean, so imagine so for example, one of our ability to see things as a thing, and that's quite important. Some animal cannot do that. It's like, so for example, here you see a cup here, you see a pen here, yeah. So imagine I'm trying to catch this pen as an animal, and this pen hide behind this cup. If I cannot see this pen as a thing, then I'd be like, oh, the pen is gone. I'd be starved 3 days later, right? So it's a quite important survival ability to see things as concrete, as solid.
But we're often employing this when we're not in danger. We're not in survival mode. Our minds are manufacturing all the fears.
Yeah, well, yeah, and the fear again has its evolutionary advantage. Imagine someone has no fear at all. That person would not survive too long.
Mm.
So the quick answer is there are survival value tool to it. Yet at the same time, conventional, and then they belong. But Buddha never tell us to let go of those ability anyway. You shouldn't let go of those ability. And this is the picture I'm trying to demonstrate as well here. So Harry, what do you see here in this picture?
Oh, yeah. I know. I see the it's a duck rabbit.
Right.
It's yeah.
Right. So
It's
so for most of us, right, we only see, let's say, the duck, right? But for Buddha, the Buddha can see the duck and the rabbit, right? It's like, and you cannot let go one with, you can't really get rid of one, right? The conventional truth is as important as the ultimate truth. Just because you're awakened does not mean you know how to use the iPhone. You still need to learn how to use the iPhone.
and the duck and the rabbit both have Buddha nature.
Yeah, that's right. So this is what? Not the duck, not a rabbit, neither nor, right? But so I would say the when we talk about no self, don't mistake it as a description of a reality, but more as just to point out what the reality is not. So, I think I like to use Cinder Clause as an example, Is there Santa or there's no Santa? If you tell kids there's no Santa, that's kind of quite problematic, right? Because the kid's going to be like, yeah, but there's gifts and then there's, so everything's there, but there's no Santa, right? So our mind definitely have many great functions and could do many great things, yet it's not as simple as we perceive it to be. Maybe that's and the extreme example of that would be people who come into therapy. Not only they see there's a self, but they have a rigid self, right? Like what I said earlier, I'm a loser, I'm a failure. That's a quite rigid sense of self. So, but to tell them they're not, you need to do a lot of work. So no self would be sort of a ultimate version of mental health, right? I mean, that makes sense. Yeah. So I think I can end here today with the 3 minutes left. Any other?
Yeah, Peter.
Yeah.
It's Bob again. I wanted to share something that Guo Chouse told me many years ago that helped me a lot.
Okay.
Because being afraid, like, what happens if I lose myself? What happens then? And like, what is all this? And all this stuff used to have it still does, but a stronger effect on me. And he very calmly said to me, when you lose yourself, you don't lose anything, you gain everything.
Yeah.
And I really kind of like that, because it took away a lot of the fear I felt of like, well, I lose it, you gain everything. And I know lose and gain is tricky words, but I think it pointed to, don't be afraid.
Yeah. And I often like to use my favorite example. You're not having a wrong sense of self is like mistaken an iPhone's just a phone. So when you realize you're not just a phone, you could do a lot more. You still maintain your phone function, but you're not just a phone, you're an iPhone, Yeah. So
thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Any other question for me? I didn't get very far today.
Yeah.
Did I? I have a lot more slides, but I didn't. Yeah. All right. Next time. My main point today was to talk about what does it mean to be mentally healthy, but that's too boring, right? We like to talk about something that's more interesting. Anyway, I could talk about it next time.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Peter Lin, for giving us the Dharma talk today. And please, can everyone join palms and let's bow to Dr. Peter Lane. Thank you. Amitofo.